Welcome, everybody, to this webinar on data and agri-food systems and examples from the past and the present and ideas for the future. This webinar is the sixth of a series facilitated by GFAR, the Global Forum on Agricultural Research and Innovation, and co-convened with the Technical Center for Agricultural and Rural Cooperarion, CTA, and the Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition Initiative, GODAN. And this series is a follow-up on a course and a symposium that we had in Centurion in South Africa in November, where we discussed different aspects of farmers' access to data. And Ajit Maru, today's presenter, was one of the speakers at the symposium. This webinar will be slightly different from the others. It will consist of 3 presentations. And after each presentation, we can have a short questions and answers session. While Ajit speaks, you can still type your questions in the chat window. And then when we have the Q&A session, we will relay the questions to Ajit. A short presentation of Ajit. Ajit Maru has almost 40 years of experience in the area of agricultural research. He has served for several national and international organizations, like the Indian Council of Agricultural Research, the National Dairy Development Board of India, the International Service for National Agricultural Research, ISNAR, the Dhirubhai Ambani Institute for Information and Communication Technology, and for several years, the Global Forum on Agricultural Research and Innovation. And as he says, he now follows his lifelong interest in understanding and improving the livelihoods of smallholder farmers. So I give the floor to Ajit, and I will run the presentation from here. So I will start the video now.
Good day. I am Ajit Maru. Welcome to this webinar where we are going to discuss the past, present and future of data in agriculture and agri-food systems. The prelude to this seminar are the GFAR GODAN white paper and the seminars in this series. I will only carry on from these events, so in many instances, for further background I discuss, these materials may be very useful. The main objective of this webinar is to discuss what will be needed as institutions and structures to support farming, agriculture, and agri-food systems that are becoming increasingly data-driven, information-rich, and knowledge-intensive. We will try to learn from the past and examine what is its possible continuity for the future. This seminar has 3 sessions. In the first session, I will be discussing the data ecosystem framework that I am proposing, and I will be validating it with examples. In the second session, I will use the framework to discuss India's efforts in data-driven farming and agriculture. This is a sort of using the framework as a diagnostic tool. In the third session, the data ecosystem for the future will be discussed. After each session, we will have a question and answer session. Before we go further, let me discuss the nomenclature that I would be using. First of all, farming is the process of cultivating and producing a crop of plants or animals. Agriculture is the larger envelope that deals with the inputs, throughputs, and outputs from farming. Agri-food systems comprise of processes related to agriculture production, processing, logistics that enable flows of commodities, finance and information, their marketing, consumption, reuse and recycling, as also management of waste. I illustrate these nomenclature with these illustrations. The first one is about farming, the second one is about agriculture, and the third one illustrates the entire agri-food system. Developing ICT applications for agri-food systems requires developing many components. In this webinar, we are only going to focus on this particular area of supporting institutions and structures for developing a data ecosystem for agri-food systems. Data-driven agriculture is not a new phenomenon. Agriculture has always been data-driven. Farmers, since the domestication of plants, always had to know when to plant, where to plant, when to harvest, and how to predict harvest. In this webinar, I am presenting a framework for agri-food data ecosystems. Let us start with ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt was one of the earliest civilizations that grew around agriculture. Data and information management was around the most vital of all agricultural resources, water. Institutions like monarchy, religion, belief systems emerged in societies to manage farming, agriculture, and water. Structures such as pharaohs or rulers, priests, and temples for religion emerged to manage the data and information the society needed around their critical resource and for the production of the most important product that they needed. The ancient Egyptians used their own technology to record data around the water that they needed. They had nilometers. I illustrate them here, one of them at Aswan, where standardized measurements such as the level of flood and the consequent water and fertile sediment availability were taken through nilometers. This helped predict the peak of the flood and with it the extent of cultivable land and possible harvest. This information was very useful for taxation, the organization of labor, and through it, possibly the making of the pyramids. In other ancient civilizations that had more widespread sources of water, such as small rivers, lakes, and rains, such as of Mohenjo-daro and the Mayans, city-states emerged. They developed sophisticated calendars since they considered time as one of their most critical agricultural resources. Their governance systems, institutions, and structures emerged around the use of calendars for agriculture. Thus, every society developed their own data ecosystem. This is the framework that I propose. In every data ecosystem, to manage and control data, we need to know the societal needs, objectives, and goals, the policies that support the societal objectives, the strategies that would help enable achieve the policy goals, the technologies that would support the strategies, the rules, regulations, standards, and norms that would help manage and use the data, the structures that would support the efficient management and use of the data, the infrastructure that would support the data ecosystem, and the capacities that would be needed to manage the entire data ecosystem. Thus, this is the framework that we can use to describe a data ecosystem. This affects the collection, collation, storage, processing, analysis, interpretation, and use of data at one end, as also the availability, accessibility, affordability, appropriation of data and information by a society, usefulness, relevance, timeliness, trustworthiness, and effective use of data and information for farming, agriculture, and agri-food systems. Let us now validate the frameworks with several other examples. I have already discussed ancient Egypt, where water was one of the critical agricultural resources and how the data ecosystem was developed. Land can also be a very critical agricultural resource. Various societies have developed elaborate agricultural data ecosystems to manage ownership of land and with it taxation, etc. The following few examples will help us validate the framework so that it can be used for future development of data ecosystems. Of course, starting with ancient Egypt, there were policies to use water and fertile silt, annual flooding of Nile for maximizing crop production. The strategies were around monitoring the flood level of the Nile, which indicated land available for cultivation and the labor needed, forecast the crop production, and in turn, how much taxation and income would be there in the kingdom. The technology that they used were the Nilometers along the course of the river Nile. The institutions were around religion, decrees of the pharaoh as the ruler. The structures were the priests, the bureaucracies with scribes who would record the data, provincial governors, temples, etc. And the infrastructure and capacities. For example, they use papyrus-based hieroglyphic recording. And in fact, hieroglyphics was a way of recording data. Literacy, temples as data, and information repositories, which we all know about in Egypt. Inca agriculture is another very interesting example. Incas were composed of self-sufficient communities who used to produce for trade, and this trade was through barter. The strategy around land was that it was owned by three components: emperor, state religion, and the community. The community land was distributed by the head of the community, and couples and individuals were given this land. The community used to contribute labor to the emperor and state religion's land. The technology was very interesting. They used to manage data through what are called as cupus. An example of this is a photograph. These cupus were knots on a string. The Ainu leader, the priests and the emperor's ruling society norms were the institutions in the Incan civilization. The structures were around self-sufficient communities who would produce enough for themselves as well as for barter. And the structure and capacities were basically the extensive road system which allowed very fast communication, storage systems along the roads, and traditions passed through generations. New World agriculture in the Americas was about conquering and cultivating new lands. The strategy was around conquest and subjugation of native people, migration, and slavery, and therefore land ownership and establishing it became very, very important. Along with it was the slave trade. So records had to be maintained about land ownership and about slaves, etc. The institutions there were about kings and governors and writ, the religion, etc., all of which contributed to the conquest of these lands and the use of these lands. The structures were around courts, land record offices, surveys. The infrastructure and capacities were the government bureaucracy for managing records and for taxation. Intensification of agriculture that occurred around the 19th and 20th centuries was around increasing the productivity of land. Strategies that were used to increase productivity was through fertilizers, farm machinery, and higher yielding seed. Of course, the technology to maintain data was the land records and the farm-based records for inputs and produce, which was new compared to earlier traditional methods of farming. Institutions that were established were the land record offices and, interestingly, the land grant universities, which started using the data and information to improve agriculture. The structures for this particular data ecosystem were around land records and the courts and surveys that would handle the entire data sets that were associated with the land and the productivity of the farms. The infrastructure and capacities, of course, were the government bureaucracy for managing records and taxation, and extension agents who also used to maintain a lot of data at the farm level. As records show, the Indian subcontinent has a long history of data ecosystems for agriculture. The British brought in commercialization of agriculture, which was around production of indigo, cotton, tobacco, etc. for export to the Great Britain. With the British, the evolution of the zamindari system to manage land and land records emerged. The technology was, of course, the land records and provincial production records. The institutions which were developed were around district collectors, kings and princes and zamindars. The structures that emerged to manage this data were around small kingdoms, collectorates, talukdars and patwaris from district to taluka and village level data management. The infrastructure and capacities, the government bureaucracy for managing records and taxation. In fact, the Indian education system evolved because of this reason. The Anand pattern of milk cooperatives in India was initially devised to supply the 4 metros in India with fresh milk. At that point of time, fresh milk was a very much a scarce commodity for these urban areas. What it did was improve marketing of milk through milk cooperatives. The technology used in these Anand pattern milk cooperatives was maintaining manual registers for milk board and fat percentage of the milk at primary cooperatives and mainframe computers at district dairy headquarters. The institutions that helped develop these were the cooperative laws and the National Dairy Development Board, which regulated the development of these cooperatives. The structures were around village level primary milk cooperative and the district cooperative union and the state level federation for milk marketing. The infrastructure and capacities that were developed were around milk collection centers, which also recorded data, roads, telephones, primary milk cooperative secretary and staff, and dairy union staff. In fact, only places where there were roads and telephones, the milk collection and the dairies became much more successful. Thus, data ecosystems till now were developed around the critical resource, which was either water or land. But now, with data and information also becoming critical resources in market-oriented agriculture, agricultural data ecosystems are undergoing rapid transformation. In the next session, we will try to analyze, using this framework, what happens when agriculture becomes more knowledge intensive.
So thank you very much, Ajit. This was the first session. If it's okay for you, we will ask a couple of questions to Ajit now. And otherwise, he also said you can send him questions. At the end of the session, you will see that there is Ajit's email address, and you can also email questions to him. This first session was more of an introduction, and it was more about the past. So do you have questions? Otherwise, I would have a question, Ajit, regarding these elements of the framework. Do you consider them all at the same level, or is there a dependency? Like, for instance, policies and strategies are the starting point, the most important part, and then technology, etc., follow.
Well, at the moment, we don't see things happen that way, but the hierarchy is what I see is emerging, because what we have is a lot of dead ends when we start in between. Say, take for example, we initiated a large number of applications without understanding the issue of say standards. Say, take for example, another issue is related to social media at the moment. You know, we started with the use of Facebook-like applications, and then what has happened is that we find that the rules and regulations and all the other things that were meant for another era or different type of a society does not fit into the Facebook type of issues, and now we are trying to catch up. What I have tried to put is a very, should we say, an idealized
framework, which from experience we can say that this is the way we should go forward, and then only will applications run. Because say, take for example, the reason why I was looking at it, a large number of developing countries would be going into data-driven agriculture. They have to go into, they have no alternative. Mm-hmm. But what sort of experience they can get? How can they leapfrog the period of development? Say it took us about 8 to 9, 10 years to reach this point. Mm-hmm. But if you want other countries to move faster, what are those issues that you should take into consideration? And I think this framework helps into looking into that sort of an issue.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I think I will go directly into the second session, because I think that's more something that can raise questions from participants.
Oh, yes.
I will start now. Yes. Thank you, Ajit.
In this session, we will use the framework that I proposed to discuss India's efforts in data-driven farming and agriculture. Indian agriculture is largely smallholder farmer-driven, and about 55% of India's population depends on agriculture. Farmer incomes are falling, and the government has now initiated a major program to double farmers' incomes by the year 2022. This initiative aims to increase productivity and profit of farming. There are also several other initiatives in agriculture for increasing productivity, such as through use of soil health cards for fertilizers, more crop per drop for use of waters, weather forecast through SMS, electronic national agricultural market, minimum support price, the Kisan Bima or insurance Yojana, the iKhedut and Kisan call centers to inform farmers using ICTs. India is a countrywide 2G, 3G and a fast-growing 4G cellular network, and there is a program called Digital India which aims to connect all villages and entire country with broadband internet connectivity. India's agriculture now needs to become more knowledge intensive. More information is needed to farmers, and this information has to be unique to every farmer's problem, because each farmer in India has a unique problem and needs a unique solution to his problems. India's prowess in ICTs is well known across the world. However, India has been very slow to develop truly useful farm-level data and information management systems that its farmers need, and that can support India's shift to more knowledge-intensive agriculture that the doubling of farmers' incomes demands. The reason why is a question that we must ask. We can examine the reasons why using the framework that I propose. If we look at it, there is a lack of coherent, holistic policy envelope for ICT use in agriculture development, and with it, a strategy. All initiatives are being implemented independent of each other, especially when it comes to using data and information. There are inadequate rules, regulations, norms, standards for managing data and information. There is a lack of common pool of agriculture data and information for use by applications because of the lack of standards, especially for interoperability. This also increases the cost of data because the same data has to be collected over and over again. And then there are lack of applications platforms to assure quality of data information applications for use by all stakeholders and especially by farmers who are many a times not very used to the use of ICTs. This figure illustrates the multiplicity of sources of data and the type of data that is needed to make data-driven agriculture possible for Indian farmers. This data needs to be integrated, and that integration has to be used in an application for the farmers to identify the issues which affect his or her farming.
Since there is no interoperability of the data, because there are no standards, these applications have to be developed independent. And you can imagine the number of applications a farmer has to use if he wants useful information for his farming. The result of India's efforts to use ICTs in agriculture has been that there is now a mixed bag of applications, most of them in a pilot stage. What has also happened is that there are closed agricultural data and information systems, example ITC's eChopal, which does not share data with other applications of second or third party, such as the government or the private sector. There is a lack of third-party applications as private sector is reluctant to invest, and individual small and medium entrepreneurs cannot afford the cost of data collection and management of their applications for farming. We can therefore conclude that without an adequate and appropriate data ecosystem, progress has been impeded in making Indian agriculture data-driven and more knowledge-intensive, which is essential to double farmers' incomes through increase in productivity and profit.
Thank you. Oh, we have an observation here from Ramarao. Historically, farm data was collected as a means to revenue to governments. The governments no longer get direct revenue from farmers, but make much more from agri-based processes. Thus, there is change in nature of data required by government now. Ajit, do you want to comment on this?
Well, Ramarao is very well attuned to the Indian situation. Yes, he is right. Though we did used to collect a lot of data on the production and productivity. If you look at the data that has been reported in the historical archives, you will see that, when we are talking of organic agriculture, the yields of rice in the Kaveri Delta, as per the data that has been recorded and is available in the India House now with the British Council Library, you realize that the productivity of rice in the Kaveri Delta was much higher than what is available now. So this sort of data has been very useful, I mean to say, even to understand the type of agriculture that we might be using in future, the way we are talking of organic agriculture. But yes, Dr. Ramarao is very right. Though, if he remembers correctly, in the 1970s, we had a system called the levy system. I remember in Andhra Pradesh and in Telangana, where I was resident, because of the food shortages that we had, procurement shortages, every farmer had to give a particular, say, 10% or 15% of the harvest as a crop, as a product, not financially. And records used to be kept by patwaris or village level recorders. They were in charge of the land records as well as the productivity. If you also look at the type of revenue collection, it was based on the type of crop you grew. It was not only land. Of course, what he says is very right, that now there's no tax on agriculture production, but indirectly it is collected through agri-food processing. It becomes fascinating when you look at these data systems from this perspective. Yeah, Valeria.
Yeah, Dr. Ramarao, I hope this was a satisfactory answer or comment. I also have another comment here, Ajit, from Ogweno Tom. He says, it is also very expensive for some developing countries to collect and manage the data needed to make agriculture data-driven. And like you said, the unique problems may not give an opportunity for developers to come up with unique data management systems for a data-driven agriculture.
Well, I'll come back to my very rather, pet, should we say, rant that I always give. And that is that with agriculture becoming globalized, we will have a divide where countries can do or agricultural commodity more economically. And here I use the word economically in a different way. It's not only monetary, but in the use of all the resources, especially water and land resources. Those countries would be dominating the agricultural commodity markets. And those countries that cannot keep up with the shift, the paradigm shift that is occurring in agriculture would be at the loose end. So ultimately what I see is that countries would have to shift into becoming more knowledge intensive, which is going to use a lot more data than they are using now. Now, if those countries cannot be helped or cannot be supported to balance sort of shift that is occurring, we would end up into a world which is much more crisis ridden than it is already there. Say, take for example, there'll be huge, should we say, displacements from rural areas, which is already occurring. Rural employment will not be there. Countries would have to import food. All those type of issues would come. So it is very important that an international movement happens to make most agriculture in different countries to become capable of participating in these globalized markets that we are now getting. Yes, the point which has been made is very right. We find that the cost of data production, say data management in an agri-food system, an estimate that I recently made was that ultimately information and data costs about 20 to 25% of the cost of the product that is finally reaching the shelf. So you can imagine the costs of data and information that is coming up. But it's also good for economies, because the number of people who would be involved in just managing the data and information that is needed would create huge employment potentials. It will also improve the economies, the agri-food economies. If you really look at it, even in Europe, we have about 35 to 38% of the contribution to the country's GDP through agri-food systems, not agriculture. Remember, I'm talking of agri-foods here, agri-food systems. So there is a huge paradigm shift which we are still not grasping totally in many developing countries. What's happening?
Thank you, Ajit. I now have another question from Agapi Ishabakaki, and this is quite a provocative question. It is, what is the importance of data to farmers if they still face poverty, food decrease, climate change? Is there a good way you have come up with a great solution?
Well, the only solution is to lower the costs of data and its management so that it becomes affordable. Because data really, should we say, multiplies the gains that you would get from the use of resources. You would be able to participate better in the markets. So ultimately, though, say, a marginal investment in data would certainly pay huge dividends in production, productivity, and profit. So this is the shift that I'm talking about in farming and in agriculture. The shift is that in the last century, we started putting fertilizers and used high yielding seed varieties, etc. Now we have to start using data. Now, the same arguments used to come up in India, I remember, during the green revolution phase, the farmers will not be able to afford the fertilizers and pesticides and therefore the government subsidized it. These subsidies continue. Now governments will have to start looking at how they can support farmers in data management. And that's why I have been talking about this framework, because with this framework, the costs of supporting farmers will be reduced. So this is the way we'll have to look. We have to look at it in a very systematic manner. We just cannot, say, okay, we have produced one application and the farmer will be happy. That doesn't work. That's what I've been trying to say in India. So if there are any, say, supplementary, I would be it's a very interesting question. I keep on being asked this sort of a question. But we as people who understand this area, we will now need to start looking at this. I remember about 10 years ago, we were only talking about sharing data, exchanging information. But now we have to start looking at how do we build these data ecosystems. And that's the challenge that we have.
Yeah. And Jitu, I have another question for you now before we go to the next session from Malika. This is a very practical question. Are there references, documents on cost to build a system? For instance, what percentage for each component? For instance, how much for collecting data?
Well, this is a major area of research which I think we should open up very soon. We are trying to, in fact, I recently ran across a very interesting situation where I said that the cost of developing a system for a major area, say about the size of, say, England, not Great Britain, but England. And I put up a cost. I said, this is the cost. And I was immediately challenged and said that, well, that's too much. I said, how do you say it's too much? That's the question. We are still in a very evolving stage. If we, supposing in 1960s or 1970s, if we had said, what would be the cost of using telephones universally across the world, we would have had a very different answer than the answer that we get now.
Yeah.
So I think it's a very interesting question. I am working on some of these areas, and my calculations show me that approximately at around say 14 to 15 cents US cents per hectare would be the cost at this point in time. That would mean that about 7 hectares of land can be covered with data systems for $1 investment.
Thank you, Ajit. I would have another observation here, but I think we don't have enough time. But
no, go ahead. Let us look at it, Valeria.
It's actually an invitation for collaboration. Russ Davis from Brazil, he's saying that they are submitting a joint proposal to the Copernicus Global Challenge for satellite data for small rural farmers. And they're open to having partners from this group of participants here. So anybody who's interested can contact Russ. Russ, maybe you can give us an email address, or I can take it from the registration form if you had registered. Thank you. So I will move to the third session.
In this session, I will discuss how data ecosystems need to be developed for current and future data-driven farming, agriculture, and agri-food systems. For this, we need to consider the various trends affecting agri-food systems. The speed at which farming, agriculture, and agri-food systems are now transforming has never been seen before. Agri-food systems are becoming increasingly complex, with agricultural markets, both for farm inputs and outputs, becoming globalized and highly competitive. This competitiveness is forcing transformation in all agri-food systems, irrespective of whether they are in economically developed or developing countries. Those systems that do not transform are dying. The transformation of agri-food systems is now holistic, from farm inputs for cultivation to consumption and waste management in the agri-food chain, as illustrated in this figure. This is beyond the so-called farm to plate paradigm. Let me give you an example. Several industrial byproducts are now fed to livestock. Sometimes toxins like dioxin are constituents of these byproducts, and when fed to livestock, they enter the food chain. This has happened in Europe. So is the case of BSE or mad cow disease. Thus, monitoring and the traceability is required from farm inputs till consumption, and sometimes how agri-food waste is recycled or disposed of. Also, growing urban populations are demanding not only that a wide variety of foods and agriculture products are available, but they are affordable with high quality, safe, nutritious, healthy, and ethically produced. In fact, it is the consumer, many a times very far from the farmer producer, who is making decisions on farming and agriculture. The farmer is now not in control of his farm. Since agri-food systems are now globalized, with their commodities and product market chains spanning continents and countries and very complex, with commodity and financial flows intersecting across at several points, there is a need to develop international arrangements, agreements, and treaties for data and information also. At the global level, agricultural commodity trade is now governed through institutions such as the World Trade Organization, regional economic blocs such as of Europe, NAFTA and TPP, Asia, etc. Financial flows across countries are governed through institutions like IMF, regional development banks, and new institutions like the BRICS Bank. At national level, national and reserve banks exist, which have bilateral arrangements, agreements, and treaties for financial flows. It is now crucial for more efficient international trade, food security, and safety that agreements and treatments at the global level are also developed for sharing and exchanging agricultural data and information. Now, without the necessary international arrangements for agriculture-related data flows, countries that do not have adequate capacities to generate, manage, and use data and information face significant disadvantages in agricultural commodities trades. Their farmers cannot participate equitably in global markets and must do so without data and information with significant discounts. These countries are also threatened in their food security. First, there are methods such as satellite imaging coupled with weather data to predict harvest forecasts. Second, these methods can also predict the country's food import needs. Those agencies that have these capacities can govern the markets for agricultural commodities. This can lead to further poverty and lack of food security. Thus, it is for the international community to now, one, ensure fair flow of data and access across countries and across markets, provide regulatory mechanisms, standards, and other institutions to govern international flows and use of agricultural data and information, and provide international facilities to process agricultural data and information and support countries that have inadequate capacities for this purpose to build these capacities and effectively use agricultural data and information. I have already discussed in the previous session the importance of national policies and strategies in developing agricultural data ecosystem. Here I will discuss the key agricultural development policies and what they should include for use of ICTs in farming, agriculture and agri-food systems. These include the access and affordability of hardware, software and connectivity, the need for capacity development for data and information systems management, for extension,
using ICTs for entrepreneurs for developing applications and innovations, for agri-food systems actors, especially small, micro and individual entrepreneurs and farmers and producers. Policies are also needed for data and information security, safety, privacy and fair use. At the strategic level, we need to develop supporting infrastructure such as for telecommunications, transport, storage and marketing, enabling and supporting mass learning and innovation for use of ICTs in agri-food systems, revamping of existing institutions and structures and developing new institutions and structures around data management and flows, and a clear definition of government, public sector and private sector roles in the data and information ecosystem. As regards technology, technology is constantly changing. The data ecosystem should be built so that there is inbuilt flexibility, legacy management and redundancy to allow constant change and adoption of new technologies. The recent global concern on social media data has shown how important rules, regulations, regulatory mechanisms and norms are for the use of data for any purpose. In case of agricultural data, the data system safety, privacy and fair use must be regulated properly, and we must have regulatory mechanisms for data flow and equitable fair use. One of the most critical issues we now face is this need for standards around data sets and universal data sharing and exchange as related to agriculture. We must remember that standards evolve continuously, and we now need more inclusive development of standards at various levels from international to stakeholder and actor level, because the use of standards can disadvantage or advantage a particular group. Standards must also balance between effective use and costs. As with standards, we will now have to create either new structures or revamp existing structures for building up agricultural data ecosystems. At the international level, we will need regulatory mechanisms to enforce international arrangements, agreements and treaties similar to the World Trade Organization for international flow and use of agricultural data. The international community will also need to develop support systems to enhance the capacities of technologically poor and weak countries and enable effective use. In developing agricultural data ecosystems, it must be kept in mind that the concepts of farming, agriculture and agri-food systems have undergone major transformations. Because of this, many of the structures that have supported conventional agriculture, such as farmer organizations, agricultural extension and research systems, marketing structures, etc., also will need to undergo appropriate transformations. Agricultural data ecosystems now and in future will need trust centers, data repositories, and data cooperatives, as also application platforms. Trust centers will be needed to support and enable authentication, verification, validation, fair sharing and exchange, as also use of data. Data repositories are needed because data from many sources are needed by a multitude of stakeholders for a variety of different uses in farming, agriculture and agri-food systems. Accessibility of data, even when available, is a major barrier, as both the source of data and the data itself are dynamic and many have a short online life. The efficiency of applications that enable use of data for agriculture is degraded in such situations. Another major issue in data management is of redundancy and use of legacy standards and formats. To improve economics of efficiencies of data management and use, there is a need to create designated data repositories from where all applications and users can assuredly access data. As regards data cooperatives, the data of individual farms have limited value for use outside the farm.
Farming data must be aggregated if it is to be useful for participation in markets, both for inputs and output and produce. For providing sources such as for logistics, storage, managing natural farm resources such as irrigation, water, insurance, finance, governance, there are already cooperatives. While large farmers in developing countries can possibly negotiate access and use of their farm data, smallholders are at a major disadvantage. They have too little capacity and power, such as for participation in commodity markets. In agricultural data markets also they have the same disadvantages. As aggregation such as cooperatives and producer companies has helped small farmers participate more equitably in their commodity markets, a new function or a structure for aggregated data of smallholders for sharing and exchange is also essential for equitable and fair use of farmers' data and information. As indicated in case of India, where a mixed bag of applications for use by farmer has been the current pathway for ushering in data-driven agriculture and which has not yet yielded fruit, there is a need for application platforms that enable users to access assured, trustworthy applications they uniquely need for their farming and agriculture. These platforms will also enable developers and innovators appropriate environment to develop assured quality safe applications through registration and evaluation. These platforms will have standards for hosting applications and enable enforcement of rules, regulations, norms and ethical practices in use of agricultural data. These platforms will enable vertical and horizontal integration of data and information across applications and even platforms. They will also provide a level playing field for innovators and developers and ushering mass innovation in data use for farming, agriculture and agri-food systems. Data-driven agriculture will require access to widespread, almost universal connectivity, accessibility, especially cost-wise, hardware such as smart mobile phones, handheld devices, computers, machine-linked and portable sensing devices and sensors, as also application software not only for agriculture but also those that protect privacy, safety of data and electronic equipment, especially for Internet of Things linked equipment used in data-driven agriculture. A wide range of new capacities in addition to those already existing are now needed for data-driven agriculture. These include applications development, data and information systems management, analysts, extension for data-driven agriculture, research and innovation, and for supporting data-based services, logistics and administration. A critical component of the agriculture and agri-food data ecosystem is research and innovation, both as a structure and as a capacity. The emergence of a knowledge-intensive agriculture needed for supporting the transformation of agricultural systems into Agriculture 4.0 or efficient agri-food systems that make available and accessible, affordable, healthy, nutritious, safe, quality and ethically produced food and agricultural commodities requires mass innovation now possible through use of ICTs and more open access to data and information. While the conventional public sector research establishments are needed as core seeding structures for new technology, the community and private sector, especially individual, micro, small and medium sectors, are also now needed. Governments will have to create new structures such as applications and agriculture related social media platforms to encourage and enable mass innovations for data-driven farming and agriculture. As stated previously, national agricultural development policies and strategies influence the development of agricultural data and information ecosystems. These in turn influence the mode of the data and information systems as being open or closed. Closed systems such as of the many large supermarket chains, and fast food restaurants do not share data and information outside their commodity product market chains and their associated actors. Again, the amount of data shared is on need-to-know basis. This lack of sharing and consequent lack of transparency distorts agricultural commodity markets and affects trust from farmers to consumers. Countries will have to now decide whether they would like to have open, closed or semi-closed market structures, and with it the data flow structures. It must be remembered that closed chains also use public infrastructure and many a times data for private good. For smallholder farmers, forming data cooperatives that aggregate data in a closed chain between the individual farmer and the cooperative and presenting this aggregated data leverages the safety and value of the data. There are both pros and cons of open and closed data chains. This figure illustrates what I mean by open and closed data and information chains. In open data chains, data is shared openly between all actors in this market chain. There are variations of closed data chains. Many supermarket and restaurant chains do not share data openly except at the end when it is given to the consumer, and that too the data is only related to either the quality or the safety or the nutritive value of the product. I now summarize the entire framework of the agri-food data ecosystem in this diagram. I link the framework to the various processes that are engaged in managing data in the agri-food system, and I link it to the diagram that shows the agri-food chain in an agri-food system. In conclusion, in this webinar, I have described and discussed the agri-food data ecosystem. This ecosystem is the foundation for transforming today's agriculture into a data-driven, information-rich, knowledge-intensive agriculture that is now needed the world over. Thank you very much. If you have any other points to discuss beyond this webinar, you may communicate with me at mruin@yahoo.com. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ajit. The last but one diagram was really overwhelming. It would take a full session to discuss. I have already 4 questions for you from the participants. The first one is an observation from Malika. She says, especially for smallholders, data and information for decision making should be subsidized and supported by government.
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry. Well, I fully agree with that proposition, at least for the next few years in developing countries and even in developed countries. As even in Europe, I see a lot of issues coming up. But that's a very, very interesting thing that the countries would have to do. As I was telling earlier, at one time, say, take for example, we used to, in many countries, we have subsidized fertilizers. We have subsidized electricity for irrigation water, or we have even subsidized water itself through dams and etc. We have subsidized extension. So the next progression would be the subsidization of data and information. At a recent Geospatial World Forum, I was in this session, and a very interesting fact came up that the private sector will not be able to invest in agricultural data ecosystems or data applications unless and until the government supports it. the costs are of data management, especially from collection, etc., are too high. Another very important issue is, as I was talking about, is the need for new agricultural research and innovation. Without that, as I have been always, even in my seminar in South Africa, I was talking of the same issue, that if you want these rate and debt experiments that we have been conducting so far, almost all agricultural research till say about 10 years ago was how much fertilizer or how much input do we put on what date and what crop we will get. This continues in many of these developing countries also. So what happens is that without the research system and without government support for that research system as well as for the data management, we would not be able to get the initial stages of data-driven agriculture going. So I think the governments will have to seriously think about what they want to do in this area. My experience has been that there are very few people in the governments who understand these issues. It will come, but this is what happened if some of us in the 1980s and 90s, when we were trying to introduce computers into public life or public services, we had a lot of problems because there were so many issues people wouldn't understand. Today, if we recall those days, we find that that was a real challenge and a sort of thing that should not have happened. But yes, ultimately, governments will have to subsidize this data management.
Thanks, Ajit. Another question from Rama Rao. A variety of data sources and uses are evolving in both the private and public systems. But the issues are, one, which of the models are more tuned to the smallholder farmers? And two, the need for more evidence-based impact studies.
Yes, Dr. Ramarao is very correct. I personally believe in letting 1,000 bloom, 1,000 flowers bloom, you see. I think there is no way we can say which is the best and which is the worst or which is better. Farmers and users in the agri-food system will have to make their choices. The thing is, can many of us afford, many of our countries or many of our societies and communities afford that is an issue. And that brings us to a very deep economic discussion on how we can do it. Ultimately, I think there was a very interesting this year on what happens, and ultimately it was decided that we would have dictatorships if we go into data-driven agriculture. Centralization is going to become a very, very important issue. Without centralization, costs will not come down. So this is a rather interesting debate that we would like to go into.
Yeah. We may have another webinar on this topic.
Well, I would be very willing to join that.
We may plan one, yes. There is another question now from Ogueno Tom. I think he was referring to the moment when you were discussing the data ecosystem, you were describing the various components, and he's asking, does this provide a platform for a multi-actor participation? Because the only mentioned are the government, the public sector, and the private sector. And he's asking, are all the actors in agriculture accommodated in these three sectors?
Yeah, I meant to say the generally we categorize everything into 3 or 4. Government is also equated with public sector, the private sector, and the community sector, which I say is very important. I've been talking about not only public-private partnerships, but I've been talking about public-private community partnerships in this sort of new activities that we are entering into without involving the community. Say, take for example, I've been talking about the issue of standards. If we don't include all actors in developing standards, we would be, as I said, benefiting a particular group which sets up the standards. So the involvement of all users is going to be very, very important in the new data ecosystems that we are developing.
Thank you, Ajit. Now we have a final observation from Raz, which I think, still following up on what we were saying, we may have another webinar discussing these issues further. Russ is saying that he would like to have further discussions on how we are making this kind of information available as required to be most helpful to the farmer without the need to be a developer or a PhD.
Well, most of the people who are helping farmers are not PhDs or professors. They are really working on the field, and I see. But of course, we need the backup from these classes also. So I think ultimately, yes, the use by farmers is something which we must debate upon. I think we had a good discussion on the sidelines in South Africa, but not as a mainstream.
Yes.
Maybe we can try a mainstream discussion.
Definitely. We will make a new plan for another webinar or even just an online discussion. So I will send a follow-up email to everybody, to all the participants. And then if you're interested in specific topics related to this area, we can organize a follow-up discussion. And of course, you can contact Ajit. You saw his email address in the presentation. Ajit, everybody's thanking you here in the chat.
I would thank all of you to participate. I think this is a very important area that needs lots of attention. Let us keep on discussing, and maybe Valeria will develop another paper on it.
Together with good authors like you.
Well, that would be a good recognition. Thank you.
At the beginning of the chat, you can find the links to the paper, to the workshop that we had in South Africa, and the symposium that we had in South Africa. So that's the background material. Thank you very much, Ajit, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you.